Imagine waking up to a peaceful morning on your rural property, only to have a self-proclaimed HOA tyrant storm in and declare war over land she has no claim to. Little did I know, this bizarre encounter would ignite a battle of epic proportions, filled with fake fines, forged documents, and a revenge so sweet it would dethrone her forever. I was sipping my morning coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise over my quiet 5-acre property when a screech of tires shattered the calm, and a woman in a neon pink tracksuit leapt out of her SUV, screaming that I owed her 3 months of HOA fees. I nearly spit my coffee when she announced herself as the president of a homeowners association I didn't even belong to, waving a clipboard like it was a royal decree, shouting that my land was now under her jurisdiction because she just decided the boundary line was wrong. I stood there barefoot, stunned as she planted a plastic HOA sign at the end of my driveway, declaring my land community property, while my dog barked at her like she was an alien invader. That was the moment I knew I wasn't just dealing with a rude neighbor. I had just been drafted into a war I never signed up for. The woman, Karen, strutted toward me, demanding an immediate $1,500 payment or further legal action, threatening to tow my truck, repaint my barn, and fine me daily for having a wooden fence she personally didn't like. When I told her calmly that my land was outside of the HOA, she laughed, tossed her hair, and said, "Not anymore." Like she was queen of the neighborhood, and I was a peasant trespassing on her kingdom. That bizarre showdown set the tone for everything that followed. Because Karen wasn't just entitled. She was delusional, persistent, and as I would learn, capable of turning my peaceful life into a circus I hadn't bought tickets for. She marched around my yard, snapping pictures of my shed and my garden gnome collection, mumbling about unsightly landscaping and non-compliant decorative items while I followed her with a bewildered look, recording everything on my phone. My first instinct was to laugh because surely this was some sort of prank. But when she taped a fake HOA violation notice to my own front door and took a selfie with it like she was handing out royal justice, I realized she was serious. My neighbor Mike wandered over holding a coffee mug, whispering under his breath that I had just met the self-proclaimed tyrant of the local HOA, a woman known for slapping fines on anyone who so much as breathed wrong in her view. The thing was, my property was legally outside of her HOA's map. I had checked it thoroughly when I bought it, and there was no way on earth I owed her a single cent. That didn't stop her from leaving a pink envelope in my mailbox later that morning with urgent "Pay immediately or face consequences," scrawled on it in glitter pen like some kind of deranged ransom note. By noon, she was back. This time, dragging her husband, Ron, a man who looked like he hadn't slept since 2002, as a witness to my supposed non-compliance. Ron didn't say much, just stood there sipping from a fast food soda cup while Karen barked orders about where I needed to move my truck and how many inches my grass should be. I tried reasoning with her, showing her my deed, but she dismissed it with a wave of her manicured hand, declaring, "Paperwork can be wrong, but I'm never wrong." Mike stood by laughing so hard he nearly spilled his drink, muttering that this was going to end badly for her, and I might as well grab popcorn. The drama escalated quickly when Karen threatened to call the sheriff to forcibly collect dues, and I told her I'd gladly welcome the sheriff so we could settle the matter legally. Her face twisted like I'd insulted royalty, and she hissed that I would regret crossing the HOA. A line so over the top I half expected background thunder to roll in on cue. Later that afternoon, as if to prove her point, she installed a flimsy HOA. "No trespassing without approval" sign right in my driveway, blocking my truck. I filmed the whole thing and called the county office to confirm once again that my property was not under any HOA's control. The county clerk chuckled knowingly and said this wasn't the first time Karen had expanded HOA boundaries on her own terms, but it was definitely the boldest attempt yet. I learned that 2 years ago she tried to fine a farmer a mile away for having unapproved livestock despite his ranch being legally outside her jurisdiction as well. I started realizing that Karen ran the HOA like a personal thief, collecting fake fees and bullying anyone who didn't bow to her. That night over beers on my porch with Mike, I drafted a plan to deal with this nonsense, figuring the sheriff would set things straight. But Karen had other plans. Around midnight, my motion sensor lights came on, and I spotted her creeping onto my land again, this time measuring my fence with a tape measure and muttering about non-compliant fencing regulations. I yelled from my porch, asking if she'd lost her mind, and she screamed back that as of tomorrow, my property legally belonged to the HOA because she had corrected the zoning lines at a board meeting. I couldn't even reply through my laughter, but that was the exact moment I realized this wasn't going to stop unless I fought back hard. I promised myself that if she wanted a war over land she didn't own, she was going to regret every single step she took onto my property. What I didn't know yet was just how far she would go, or how far I'd have to go to put an end to her reign of fake fines and false authority. A battle that would pull in the sheriff, the entire neighborhood, and end with a level of revenge that would make Karen wish she had never tried to mess with the wrong man's land. The morning after the bizarre midnight fencing inspection, I woke up to find a fresh stack of neon orange HOA violation notices plastered to my mailbox, my front door, and even taped to my dog's water bowl like some deranged art installation. Each one was more ridiculous than the last, accusing me of everything from unregistered bird activity because of the sparrows nesting in my tree to unauthorized plant species because I had wildflowers in my yard. And of course, the big one, failure to remit HOA fees, now subject to lien action. I stared at the pile in disbelief. Part of me wanting to laugh, part of me wanting to scream. Karen had clearly spent the night concocting a fictional HOA rule book just for me. Determined to crush my patience before breakfast, I crumpled the notices and tossed them in the trash. But my blood was boiling. I decided this war wasn't going to be fought by playing defense anymore. It was time to gather evidence, build my case, and turn her own tactics against her until she had no ground left to stand on. By mid-morning, Mike rolled up with his coffee and a mischievous grin, saying he'd heard from another neighbor that Karen had been bragging about bringing the rogue landowner to heel, and planned to hold a special HOA board meeting to discuss my violations. The way he said it made it sound like I was some outlaw in an old Western movie, and Karen was the sheriff of Nonsense Town. I told him it was time to crash her little meeting, not with fists or shouting, but with cold hard proof that she was full of it. Mike offered to help dig up HOA maps and bylaws to show once and for all that my property wasn't under their authority. We spent the morning pulling records from the county website and even drove down to the office to get stamped copies of my property deed and the official HOA boundary map. The clerk behind the counter rolled her eyes when I explained the situation and muttered that Karen had a reputation for creative map drawing, which almost made me feel sorry for whoever had to deal with her daily antics. Almost. That afternoon, as we were pinning evidence to a corkboard in my kitchen, like detectives in a crime drama, Karen strutted onto my land again. This time with a megaphone and a crowd of HOA board members in tow, holding what looked like a neighborhood trial on my front lawn. She stood there proclaiming to anyone who'd listen that I was endangering property values by refusing to pay fees and allowing my unregulated land to blight the community. Mike filmed the entire circus, biting his lip to keep from laughing out loud as Karen dramatically pointed to my wooden fence like it was a crime scene and accused me of refusing the modern aesthetic of the neighborhood. When I calmly stepped forward and held up my deed, stating yet again that my land was legally outside her HOA, she snatched the paper from my hands, glanced at it, and scoffed, saying, "That's just your opinion." The crowd gasped, half of them looking embarrassed to even be part of her crusade. But Karen was too wrapped up in her own fantasy of power to notice the awkward silence building around her. Things got more ridiculous when she threatened to tow my truck unless I paid emergency back dues by sundown. Mike piped up, asking which towing company she planned to call since they'd probably laugh in her face once they saw my deed, and that made the crowd snicker. Karen turned beet red, barking that this was an official HOA proceeding and that anyone laughing was in violation of community decorum. At that point, even Ron, standing behind her, clutching his soda cup like a life raft, mumbled something about maybe leaving before this got worse. She glared at him and hissed for him to shut up, then turned back to me with what she probably thought was a victorious smile, declaring that if I didn't pay up, she'd take me to court and legally absorb my property into the HOA. I leaned in just enough for her to hear and told her I'd see her in real court with real law on my side, and I wasn't the least bit scared of her. Make-believe HOA empire. She flinched, her smile twitching for just a moment before storming off with her entourage like an angry queen retreating to her castle. That evening, I learned from another neighbor, Linda, that Karen was planning to forge documents claiming my property had always been part of the HOA and file a complaint with the county. Linda wasn't exactly a saint herself, known for gossip and stirring drama, but even she thought Karen was going too far this time. She offered to tip me off if Karen tried anything new, saying she was tired of watching her neighbor bully people and needed someone to finally put her in her place. I thanked her, though I knew Linda's loyalties shifted with the wind, and added her information to my growing arsenal of evidence against Karen. I spent the rest of the night drafting a timeline of every insane thing she had done in just the past 48 hours, labeling photos, saving videos, and preparing for the inevitable moment when the sheriff got dragged into this nonsense for the first time. The next morning, sure enough, Karen upped her game. I woke to find a bright red final notice of eviction taped to my front door, handwritten on HOA letterhead, claiming I had 24 hours to vacate community land or face forcible removal. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. But then I noticed that she had copied the county seal at the top of the paper, which made it not just stupid, but possibly illegal. I called the sheriff's office and explained everything from the fake fees to the fake eviction. The deputy on the phone sighed and said this sounded like a Karen classic and promised to send someone to talk to her before she got herself arrested for harassment. I was glad to hear that, but I wasn't going to rely on anyone else to protect me from this lunacy. Mike came over again that afternoon, bringing a drone to fly over my property and document every inch of it for proof that Karen had been trespassing repeatedly. We caught her on camera later that day sneaking around my shed, measuring distances with a yardstick and muttering about non-compliant storage units. I shouted from my porch, asking if she'd ever heard of private property laws, and she shrieked something about how laws don't matter when community values are at stake. Mike nearly fell over laughing, saying she sounded like a dictator from a bad sitcom, and I couldn't disagree. But behind the humor, I was angry, angrier than I'd been in years. Because this woman thought she could bully me out of my own home, rewrite the rules of reality, and steal what was mine just because nobody had stood up to her before. I swore to myself that I was going to make her regret every step she'd taken onto my land. What started as a bizarre annoyance was rapidly turning into a high-stakes battle for my rights. And I was ready to fight dirty if I had to. Because if Karen wanted a war, she was about to learn I could play a lot smarter and a lot meaner than she ever imagined. The morning sun had barely climbed over the horizon when I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel, followed by the unmistakable slam of a car door that signaled trouble was back at my doorstep. Karen had apparently woken up with fresh energy and a new plan to try and intimidate me into paying the phantom HOA fees she had invented. This time she arrived with a small caravan of self-appointed enforcers, clipboard warriors, and matching polo shirts, and most importantly, a smug grin that told me she thought today would finally be the day she bent me to her will. I leaned against my porch, railing with my coffee, calm on the outside, but already seething inside, wondering how far this woman was willing to push her luck before someone besides me finally called her bluff. Mike, who had stayed over after last night's planning session, stepped out beside me, yawning, muttering something about betting $5 that Karen would invent 3 new HOA laws before noon. We were still laughing at that when Karen strutted forward, waving a rolled-up set of papers like they were holy scripture, announcing that today was a compliance verification visit backed by law enforcement support. Sure enough, a sheriff's cruiser rolled in behind her and my stomach tightened. I knew I had nothing to hide, but the fact that she had convinced an officer to come out made me realize this was going to be one of those days where logic would have to wrestle with lunacy. Sheriff Daniels stepped out of his car, looking less like a man ready to enforce the law and more like someone regretting every life choice that led him to this moment. His tired eyes flicked between Karen and me, and I could already see the question forming in his head. Why am I here? Karen wasted no time launching into a dramatic monologue about how my property was a menace to the community, how I had refused to pay mandatory dues, and how I had been hostile to HOA regulations, all while pacing the gravel driveway like a lawyer giving closing arguments to an invisible jury. I let her rant for a good 5 minutes before Daniels held up his hand, asking calmly if I had any paperwork to show my property wasn't under her HOA's control. Without saying a word, I walked over to the porch table where I had prepared a neat stack of documents the night before, including county maps, my deed, and a notarized statement from the land office confirming my exemption from HOA jurisdiction. The sheriff skimmed the first few pages, raised an eyebrow, and looked at Karen like a teacher about to scold a disruptive student. But Karen wasn't ready to give up yet. She snatched the papers from his hands, waving them around while shouting that official maps can be wrong, and that the HOA had corrected the boundaries internally, meaning I was now legally under their authority, whether I liked it or not. Mike snorted so loudly he almost choked on his coffee, and even Sheriff Daniels cracked a reluctant grin before telling Karen that's not how property law worked. Karen's face flushed red, but instead of backing down, she doubled down, pulling out her own evidence in the form of a crudely altered map that looked like it had been printed on an old office copier with a red marker circle scribbled around my land and the words, HOA controlled zone, written in shaky handwriting. Daniels blinked, trying to hide his disbelief, then asked her calmly where she had obtained this map. She said proudly that she had drafted it herself after community approval, as if she were a medieval queen issuing land grants. That was the breaking point for the sheriff, who rubbed his forehead and muttered something under his breath about needing a vacation before telling her point blank that she had no legal authority over my land and that she needed to stop harassing me immediately. Karen shrieked that the sheriff was enabling lawlessness, spinning toward her HOA entourage and demanding they witness how corrupt officials were conspiring with me to destroy property values. At this point, half of her followers were edging away, clearly embarrassed by the spectacle, while Ron, leaning against their SUV, quietly sipped his soda and looked like a man praying for the earth to swallow him whole. I thought that would be the end of it, but Karen had one more trick up her sleeve. She turned to Daniels and demanded he write me a citation for failure to comply with lawful HOA directives, even trying to hand him a pre-written ticket she had scribbled on pink note paper. The sheriff just stared at her like she had grown two heads before tearing up the paper and tossing it back at her feet, saying, if she didn't leave my property immediately, the only citation he'd be writing would be for trespassing and harassment, and it would have her name on it. That set Karen off like a firecracker. She began screaming about lawsuits, threatening to go to the mayor, the governor, even the president if that's what it took to restore order to this neighborhood. She spun on her heel, stomped back to her SUV, and drove off in a cloud of dust, swearing that this wasn't over and that she'd return with irrefutable evidence of ownership. Daniels turned to me, shaking his head, saying he'd dealt with some strange calls in his time, but this one might take the cake. He advised me to keep my cameras rolling, document everything, and be prepared for more nonsense because people like her didn't know when to quit. After the sheriff left, Mike and I stood there in stunned silence for a minute before bursting into laughter, partly from relief and partly from disbelief that anyone could be that delusional. We spent the rest of the day reviewing the footage from my security cameras and drone, organizing it into a timeline that could bury Karen's fake claims once and for all if this ever went to court. I sent copies of everything to the sheriff's office and the county clerk just to have a paper trail, knowing Karen was likely already cooking up her next scheme. Sure enough, by evening, Linda called to tell me Karen had announced an emergency HOA board session where she planned to vote on annexing my land officially into the HOA, claiming once the vote passed, no law on earth could stop her from enforcing fees. The absurdity of it was almost too much to take, but behind the humor, I could feel the tension tightening in my chest. This wasn't just a petty neighbor squabble anymore. Karen was trying to fabricate laws, drag in law enforcement, and rewrite reality itself to get her way. That meant the stakes were higher than ever. Because if I let this slide even an inch, she'd never stop. As the sun set and the quiet of my property returned, I sat on my porch, sipping a fresh beer and staring out at the fence line, already plotting the next move. I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. Karen wanted a war, and I was done waiting for her to make the next strike. From now on, every step she took toward my land would be one step closer to a trap I'd set perfectly, a trap that would expose her lies, humiliate her in front of the entire neighborhood, and make her wish she had never even learned my name. 2 days passed after the sheriff's visit, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe Karen had finally understood that she had no power over me, and that the war she was trying to wage was unwinnable. That hope evaporated early on a Saturday morning when I woke up to find a shiny new metal gate bolted across my driveway, complete with an HOA logo crudely painted on a sign that read, "Authorized residents only." The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. But then reality set in. Karen had trespassed again, vandalized my property, and now I couldn't even leave my land without cutting through a barricade she had no right to install. Mike showed up minutes later, coffee in hand, jaw-dropping as he stared at the gate like he just witnessed aliens landing in the front yard. We both knew this wasn't just a nuisance anymore. This was escalation, a declaration of war. Karen had just signed in bold ink. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to wait for the sheriff to slowly wade through paperwork while Karen kept inventing new ways to harass me. This time I was setting the trap myself, and when it closed, Karen wouldn't have a single excuse left to hide behind. I started by documenting every inch of the unauthorized gate. Photos, videos, measurements, timestamps. I gathered it all like I was building a case for a high-profile trial. Mike joked that I should add dramatic music and a narrator to my recordings because the saga was starting to look like an episode of a true crime show titled The HOA Tyrant. The humor helped keep me from exploding with frustration. But underneath the jokes, my anger was sharpening into something cold and focused. I called the sheriff's office to report the trespass and vandalism, and Daniels promised he'd swing by later, but I knew Karen would just twist the story as she always did. I needed more than official warnings to shut her down for good. That's when Linda called again, whispering like she was in a spy movie, telling me Karen was bragging at the HOA clubhouse about how she'd claimed victory over me by blocking access until I agreed to pay dues. Even her own board members were starting to doubt her sanity, but none of them dared confront her because they feared her screaming fits and threats of fines. Linda offered me a copy of the HOA meeting minutes where Karen had recorded a fake vote to annex my land, hoping it would back her up legally. That was the moment the idea for the sting operation hit me like a lightning bolt. I invited Linda and a few disillusioned HOA members over to my property that evening, promising no cameras and no judgment if they just told me the truth about Karen's tactics. One by one, they spilled everything. How Karen had been forging signatures on ballots, redrawing HOA maps with crayons, and threatening anyone who questioned her leadership. They were too scared to speak up publicly. But when I suggested recording a land purchase negotiation with Karen where she might admit her scheme, several of them agreed to help set it up. The plan was simple. We'd pretend I was finally giving in, offering to sell her a piece of my land to join the HOA. And during that meeting, I'd push her to confess on camera that she knew the property wasn't legally hers to control. With proof like that, even the county and sheriff would have no choice but to crush her fake claims once and for all. The next afternoon, I baited the hook by calling Karen and sounding as defeated as I could manage, telling her I was tired of fighting and ready to negotiate terms. She pounced on the opportunity like a shark smelling blood, agreeing to meet on my porch with a full HOA committee to discuss formal annexation procedures. Mike and I hid microphones around the yard while Linda promised to keep the other board members calm during the charade. When Karen arrived, she strutted up my steps like a conquering general, barely able to hide her smug grin as she sat down across from me. I opened the conversation by saying I just wanted peace and would be willing to sell a tiny section of my property to make her happy, but only if she admitted off the record that my land wasn't technically part of the HOA yet. She hesitated at first, giving a fake lawyerly spiel about pending incorporation, but then her arrogance got the better of her. She leaned back in her chair and said proudly that she'd always known my property wasn't legally HOA territory, but that she had to take drastic measures for the good of the community, and that once people saw me give in, she could rewrite the rules permanently. Every word went straight onto the audio recorder, every self-incriminating sentence a nail in the coffin of her scheme. When she finally left, strutting down my driveway, certain that victory was hers, Mike and I replayed the recording, grinning ear to ear as her voice admitted every lie she had told the sheriff and the county. This was the ammunition I needed. The next morning, I sent the recording and all my compiled evidence, maps, deeds, photos, the fake eviction notice, and now her confession to Daniels and the county attorney's office. For good measure, I made several backup copies and sent them to neighbors who had been bullied by Karen in the past. Within hours, word spread like wildfire that Karen's empire of fake rules was built on sand, and people who had been silent before were suddenly lining up to tell their own stories of harassment and fabricated fines. But Karen wasn't done yet. Before the county could respond, she pulled one last desperate stunt, marching onto my property with a padlock and chain, announcing that as interim HOA land manager, she was seizing my shed as collateral for unpaid dues. I didn't even bother arguing this time. I simply stood back and filmed every moment, waiting until she had fully chained the door shut before I called Daniels directly. He showed up 20 minutes later, shaking his head as he read my latest complaint. When I played him the recording of Karen admitting the truth, his patience finally snapped. He told her point blank that she was not only trespassing and vandalizing, but now facing potential charges for fraud, harassment, and falsifying legal documents. Karen tried to scream over him, insisting she had community authority, but the sheriff silenced her with a single sentence. "Lady, the only authority you have is to get off this man's property before I haul you to jail." Watching her storm off, shrieking threats about bigger battles to come. I knew the war wasn't finished yet, but the tide had turned in my favor. The trap had been set. The first bite had been taken. And Karen was about to find out that every step deeper into her lies was a step closer to losing everything she thought she controlled. 2 days after Karen's humiliating encounter with Sheriff Daniels, I could feel the entire neighborhood buzzing with anticipation as rumors spread about her downfall. People who had once been afraid to speak up were suddenly dropping by my porch. Some with coffee, others with beer, all sharing their own horror stories of Karen's reign of terror. One neighbor recounted how she had tried to fine him for having a bird bath because it allegedly attracted non-compliant wildlife, while another said she threatened to report his Christmas decorations to the county because the lights were too bright. It was like a comedy sketch with real-life victims. And for years, no one had dared challenge her. But now, with the recording of her admitting everything in circulation, the facade of her power was cracking, and the once untouchable queen of HOA tyranny was clinging to her throne with white knuckles. I thought maybe, just maybe, she would back off now that the law had heard her confession, but I underestimated Karen's ability to ignore reality and charge headfirst into even deeper trouble. That morning, I looked out my window to see her SUV parked partially on my property, like she had staked a claim on the dirt under its tires, and my blood pressure spiked. She was outside pacing and yelling on her phone, no doubt spinning a fresh web of lies to whoever was unfortunate enough to listen. Moments later, she marched up to my porch, slapped a thick envelope onto the table, and announced with the confidence of a mob boss that I was being sued by the HOA for damages caused to community integrity. I opened the envelope to find a stack of nonsense papers that looked like they had been whipped up on a home printer, accusing me of everything from mental harm to board members to trespassing on HOA-controlled airspace, which Mike nearly choked on when he read over my shoulder. I calmly told her that this was pure fantasy and that if she didn't leave, I'd have Daniels come back and charge her with harassment again. That's when she snapped, screaming that I would pay one way or another, drawing the attention of several neighbors who stepped out to watch the spectacle unfold. The sight of her losing control in front of her audience was pure gold. I could see fear creeping into her eyes, but she was too stubborn to stop the act. Within an hour, Daniels was back on my property, summoned by another complaint from Karen claiming I had threatened her, which my security footage easily disproved. When he arrived, I handed over the new fake lawsuit documents, and he promised to fast-track them to the county attorney for review, muttering that this woman was begging to end up in court, but not the way she thought. Karen tried to put on a show for the sheriff, crying dramatically about how my refusal to join the HOA was destroying the harmony of the neighborhood, and how she feared for her emotional well-being. Daniels cut her off, saying the only person in danger here was her, given the mounting evidence of forgery and fraud against her name. He then told her bluntly that she needed to stop trespassing, stop fabricating legal notices, and stop parking her SUV on property that wasn't hers before she wound up in jail. She stared at him, red-faced, sputtering nonsense about higher authorities and lawsuits before peeling out in her car and leaving a cloud of dust behind. Horror. Daniels turned to me and said he was starting to think it might be easier to evict her from the entire county than deal with her daily circus, which made Mike laugh so hard he almost fell off the porch. The next day, I got a call from the county office confirming that the evidence I had submitted, combined with Karen's recorded confession, was enough to file an official harassment and trespassing case against her. They also confirmed that they were opening an investigation into her misuse of HOA funds and fraudulent legal documents she had been distributing around the neighborhood. This was bigger than I imagined, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Daniels showed up with eviction papers that would force her to back off my property permanently. The thought of watching Karen's face when she realized the sheriff wasn't on her side anymore was deliciously satisfying, but I didn't want to celebrate too early. Karen had a habit of going nuclear whenever she felt cornered, and I was sure she had one more outrageous move up her sleeve before the law finally shut her down. I didn't have to wait long. The following evening, Karen made what would turn out to be her final desperate power play. She showed up with a pickup truck and a crew of hired muscle trying to haul away my firewood pile while yelling that she was collecting HOA fees in kind. The audacity was breathtaking, and for a moment, I was too stunned to speak. Mike had his phone out instantly, recording as I confronted her, demanding she leave my property immediately. She refused, instructing the men to keep loading the wood, claiming she had authority to repossess assets of non-compliant residents. That was it. I called Daniels on speakerphone, letting her hear every word as I reported an active theft and trespassing incident on my property. Daniels' voice came through the phone like thunder, ordering Karen to stop immediately or face arrest. She tried to argue that it was HOA business, but Daniels wasn't having it, promising to be there in 5 minutes and warning her that this was her last chance to back down. By the time the sheriff arrived with backup, Karen had worked herself into a frenzy, shouting at the top of her lungs about how laws don't apply to the HOA president and how she would own this land by the end of the week. Daniels calmly walked up, slapped a stack of official papers into her hands, and announced that by order of the county, she was barred from stepping foot on my property again. Furthermore, an eviction notice was being filed to remove any personal property she had left on my land, including the SUV she had once again parked halfway in my driveway to make some ridiculous point about control. The look on her face as those words sank in was priceless. She froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, utterly stunned that her empire of lies was crumbling in front of everyone. Neighbors gathered along the street, whispering and filming as Daniels explained that if she didn't comply, she'd be spending the night in jail. Ron, who had been sitting in the SUV the whole time, finally spoke up, telling her to just leave before she embarrassed herself any further. That only made her screech louder, blaming everyone but herself for this travesty of justice. But when Daniels motioned to his deputy to put handcuffs on her if she didn't step back, Karen finally broke. She screamed, stomped her feet like a toddler, but eventually retreated to her SUV and drove away, leaving her gate, her fake notices, and her fantasy of control behind. Daniels turned to me, handing me copies of the eviction paperwork, saying this nightmare was almost over and that soon, legally and physically, Karen would be cut off from any chance of trespassing again. I stood there in the fading light of the morning after Karen's eviction notice had been delivered. My property felt unusually peaceful, the kind of quiet I hadn't experienced in weeks since her constant intrusions had turned my life into a circus. I sat on my porch with my coffee, half expecting to see her SUV screeching down my driveway again, but instead there was only the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional chirping of birds. It would have been perfect if not for the eyesore parked halfway on my land like a deliberate taunt. Karen had left her precious luxury SUV, the same vehicle she had used to make dramatic entrances and intimidate neighbors, parked on the corner of my property, as if planting a flag of ownership she no longer had any right to claim. Sheriff Daniels had told her the night before to move it immediately or risk it being impounded, but true to form, she had ignored the order, probably believing that rules applied to everyone but her. As I stared at that gleaming black SUV sitting there smugly, an idea began forming in my mind, one that would not only solve the problem, but deliver poetic justice so perfectly that Karen would never forget the lesson. Mike came by not long after. And when I told him what I was planning, he nearly spit out his drink laughing, saying it was the most brilliant act of legal revenge he'd ever heard. I spent the rest of that morning making calls to verify exactly what I could do without stepping outside the law. Daniels himself confirmed that since the SUV was on my property without permission, I had full rights to block it in, fence it off, or otherwise restrict access as long as I didn't damage it. A slow grin spread across my face because that was all I needed to hear. With Mike's help, I drove to the hardware store, picked up fencing panels, posts, concrete, and everything necessary to build a solid, unbreakable perimeter around Karen's prized vehicle. We worked like men possessed, hammering posts into the ground, lining up panels, making sure every inch was sturdy and locked tight. By mid-afternoon, the SUV was trapped inside its own private cage, a shiny black monument to Karen's arrogance, surrounded by a 6-foot fence with a padlocked gate and a big wooden sign that read, "Private property, unauthorized vehicles subject to storage fees." Mike added a smaller handwritten note beneath it saying, "Contact HOA president for release." Which made me laugh so hard I had to take a break to catch my breath. Word traveled fast in the neighborhood. Before long, people began wandering over, curious about the construction project, and when they saw Karen's SUV fenced in like a zoo exhibit, laughter erupted. Neighbors who had been victimized by Karen's fake fines and power plays for years were grinning from ear to ear, some even applauding the sight of her authority symbol literally caged on someone else's land. I could already imagine Karen's face when she saw what had become of her beloved car, and the thought of her meltdown made every swing of the hammer feel like sweet victory. By the time the sun began to set, the job was done, and the fence stood tall, secure, and impossible to bypass without cutting locks or committing another blatant act of trespassing. I set up my cameras to capture every angle, knowing that the show about to unfold would be one for the history books. The next morning, like clockwork, Karen's SUV came alive as she arrived with Ron driving a second car. She marched up to the fence, her face turning an alarming shade of red as she screamed my name loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. I walked out slowly, sipping my coffee, doing my best impression of someone just waking up, and asked her what the problem was. She shrieked that I had kidnapped her vehicle, demanding I open the fence immediately. I told her calmly that the vehicle had been abandoned on my property, making it an unauthorized intrusion, and therefore I had taken steps to secure it until storage fees were paid in full. The look on her face was priceless, a mixture of disbelief, fury, and the dawning realization that for once she had no power here. Ron, clearly exhausted from being dragged into another of her battles, muttered under his breath that maybe she should just apologize and move the car. That only made her angrier, and she started yelling threats about lawsuits, police, and even federal agents coming after me for auto theft. Right on cue, Sheriff Daniels drove up, apparently already alerted by Karen's morning tantrum. He stepped out of his cruiser, looking weary but curious, asking what the commotion was this time. Karen launched into her usual dramatic tirade, pointing at the fence and screaming that I had stolen her property. Daniels turned to me for my side, and I simply handed him the footage from my cameras showing Karen parking the SUV there illegally, refusing multiple warnings to move it, and me building the fence without ever touching or damaging her car. Daniels watched for about 30 seconds before turning back to Karen and saying flatly that I was within my rights and that if she wanted her vehicle back, she'd need to sign a release acknowledging her trespass and pay the reasonable fees for unauthorized parking and storage on private property. The crowd of neighbors that had gathered started chuckling, and Karen's head whipped around, realizing for the first time that everyone was watching, phones in hand, recording every second of her humiliation. Her screeching grew louder. But this time, Daniels didn't let her get far. He held out the release form and told her plainly that she had two choices. Sign it and get her car back legally, or refuse and watch as the county ordered it towed and impounded, racking up even more fees that would come out of her pocket. The silence that followed was electric, broken only by the sound of Ron muttering that they should just sign and leave before things got worse. Karen looked like she was physically swallowing her pride, her hand shaking as she scribbled her name on the paper, glaring at me with pure hatred as if I just committed a war crime. I unlocked the gate slowly, theatrically, letting everyone savor the moment before swinging it open. Karen climbed into her SUV without another word, peeled out of my driveway, and sped off, probably vowing revenge under her breath. But the damage was done. The queen of HOA tyranny had been forced to kneel in front of the entire neighborhood, defeated by the very laws she claimed to uphold. That night, as I sat on my porch with Mike, beer in hand, watching the sun set over the quiet property, I felt a sense of satisfaction deeper than I could have imagined weeks ago when this nightmare started. It wasn't just about winning against Karen anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who had terrorized an entire community for years. And showing everyone that she could be stopped. Neighbors came by to thank me, laughing about the look on her face, some saying it was the best thing they'd ever witnessed in this town. Daniels even texted later saying he wished he could frame the footage of Karen signing that release form because it was the highlight of his career. I knew Karen wasn't done scheming completely. People like her never truly stopped, but I also knew she'd think twice before setting foot on my land again. And as I sat there under the stars, I couldn't help but feel that the best revenge was yet to come because Karen's empire of lies was still crumbling, and I had one last move to make that would ensure she never had power over anyone again. The morning after Karen had been forced to sign that humiliating release form, the neighborhood felt lighter, almost as if the collective weight of her tyranny had finally been lifted. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact or whispered behind curtains were now walking past my property smiling. Some even stopping to thank me for standing up to her when no one else dared. But I wasn't celebrating yet. I had learned one thing about Karen during this exhausting war. She never gave up quietly. Even after being evicted from my land, even after having her SUV caged and her lies exposed to the sheriff, I knew she would try to slither her way back into power. People like her fed off control, and when they lost it, they clawed at any shred of influence they could find. I was determined to finish this once and for all, not just for me, but for every neighbor who had suffered under her fake fines, absurd rules, and reign of entitlement. This final move wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice delivered in a way Karen could never ignore or erase. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Linda called me one evening with a mix of excitement and nerves in her voice, saying the HOA had called an emergency meeting to discuss leadership restructuring after multiple board members had threatened to resign. The confession recording I'd leaked had spread like wildfire, and now Karen was scrambling to hold on to her title as HOA president. While most of the community was sharpening their pitchforks, Linda invited me to attend as a concerned resident, promising that several people were ready to stand up and speak the truth if I brought the right evidence. I agreed, knowing this was my chance to expose every one of Karen's schemes in front of the very people she had manipulated for years. Mike offered to come along for moral support and maybe to throw in a few sarcastic jabs if the mood needed it. We spent the next day compiling everything. The fake notices, the forged eviction letters, the altered maps, and most importantly, the audio recording of Karen admitting she knew my property wasn't HOA territory, but wanted to expand her power base. It was a slam dunk case, and I could already taste victory, but part of me braced for whatever stunt Karen might pull when cornered. The meeting was held in the HOA clubhouse, a building Karen had decorated with plaques and self-congratulatory photos as if she were the mayor of a tiny unwanted kingdom. The place was packed with residents standing shoulder to shoulder, many holding their own piles of bogus fines and violation slips. Karen strutted in late, wearing a blazer and sunglasses indoors as though she were walking onto a courtroom stage. She immediately launched into a speech about protecting community standards, blaming me for causing unrest and warning everyone that without her leadership, property values would collapse overnight. But the usual fear she thrived on was gone. People weren't nodding along this time. They were glaring, murmuring, some even laughing under their breath. When my turn came to speak, I stood calmly, greeted the room, and laid out every piece of evidence one by one. Gasps filled the air as I read from Karen's fake eviction notice. Laughter erupted when I showed her crayon-drawn boundary map, and outrage boiled when I played the recording of her admitting to fabricating rules to take land that wasn't hers. Even Ron, sitting in the back with his usual soda cup, nodded slowly like a man who had finally seen the light. Karen tried to shout over me, screaming that the recording was fake, that the papers were taken out of context, but no one believed her anymore. Linda stood up next, adding her own story of Karen's threats and manipulation, followed by two other residents who admitted they had been bullied into paying fees that never appeared on official HOA records. The room was turning into a courtroom, and Karen was losing every second of it. Finally, a board member called for a vote to remove her as president immediately. The result was unanimous. For the first time in years, Karen's voice didn't matter. Her finger-pointing didn't intimidate anyone, and her empire collapsed right there in front of the entire neighborhood. She stood frozen, eyes wide, face pale under the fluorescent lights as the board declared her removed and barred from holding any future HOA position. The sound of applause filled the room as residents celebrated their freedom while Karen sputtered threats about legal action and coming back stronger. But no one cared anymore. Her power was gone, stripped away publicly, and there was no getting it back. But fate wasn't done teaching Karen a lesson. Within a week, the county investigation into her fraudulent activities turned up even more dirt. Misused funds, falsified HOA bylaws, and years of harassment complaints swept under the rug. She was fined heavily, threatened with lawsuits from multiple residents, and her own house, ironically loaded with unpaid legitimate fines for unapproved renovations, went into foreclosure after legal costs started piling up. When her property finally went up for auction, I couldn't resist. With help from a few grateful neighbors, I placed the winning bid, not to spitefully keep it for myself, but to make sure Karen never returned to that street with any shred of authority left. The day the auction papers were signed, I stood on the front lawn of what had once been her fortress of control, imagining the countless times she had stood here plotting new ways to torment others, and I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. Weeks later, the house was torn down, and in its place, the neighborhood came together to build a small park with a community garden. The same people Karen had bullied were now laughing and planting flowers where her living room once stood, free from the constant fear of bogus rules and invented fines. Kids played on swings, neighbors shared lemonade, and for the first time since I moved here, it felt like a true community, not a dictatorship under Karen's thumb. She was long gone, rumored to be living 2 towns over trying to start fresh. But the name Karen had become a legend in our neighborhood, a cautionary tale told with equal parts horror and humor. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun set over the quiet street, Mike joined me, holding 2 beers and wearing a grin. He raised his bottle in a toast and said to the man who caged an SUV and dethroned a tyrant. We laughed until our sides hurt. The weight of weeks of chaos finally replaced by a deep, satisfying calm. This war had started because one woman thought she could rewrite laws and bully people into submission. But it ended with truth, justice, and a poetic revenge that would be remembered for years to come. And as I looked at the little park where Karen's house used to stand, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that not only had I won my battle, but I had helped free an entire neighborhood from the grip of one entitled queen who had learned the hard way that some wars can't be won with lies, threats, and fake authority, especially when you pick a fight with the wrong neighbor.